Now it's time for today's perspective, and everyone has the right to education. The phrase itself is even in fact part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now it means in all countries, for girls and boys, as well as for all adults, and it's the adult side of it that we're talking about today. Adult education not only a right, but also a crucial asset really to facing social and economic uncertainty, and also the environmental disruptions we're all set to face over the coming years. Well, it's something that the UN's Cultural and Education branch, UNESCO, is battling for. And joining me here on set now is the director of the organisation's Institute for Lifelong Learning. That's David Atchoarena. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. You just released your global report on adult learning. I suppose as ever there's good and there's bad things that come out of it. Let's start with some good news for once. This is that in many countries the number of adults participating, particularly women as well, is actually going up.
Indeed, UNESCO just released last week the fifth global report on adult learning and education, which provides an overview of the status of adult education today. And the good finding that actually was revealed by this report is a significant improvement since 2018, the date of the previous edition of the report, when it comes to the participation of adults and in particular women. As you know, women has been it continues to be a major, I would say, priority in terms of gender equity in education in general, but including for adult learning. And we've seen that the majority of countries in the last years have made significant progress, investments and policy efforts to redress this situation and reduce the gap in terms of gender. There is still a gap. This is still a battle to fight, but there are significant improvements.
I mean, you use the word majority there. Obviously, immediately you start talking about this kind of thing, that countries like Afghanistan spring to mind, where even children can't get proper education. I mean, as you say, it's still a long way to go.
Indeed, and in particular, when it comes to illiteracy, that's still an area where the gap is actually narrowing very slowly. We still have 2/3 of illiterate in the world were women. So there are some improvements, but relatively slow. When it comes to adult education in general, the picture is more favorable and the improvements are faster, but illiteracy remains really a dark spot.
Where have you found the main problems are? I mean, one of them which I noticed in the report was migrants, obviously.
Indeed. In fact, one of the things that the report reveals is that those who need education the most are actually those who are, farthest from it. So in particular, migrants, in particular, also disabled people, and prisoners. That's also another special population that does not really have often the access to education. So 60% of countries have not reported any progress when it comes to access of those groups to education.
Why do you think this is so important? I mean, a lot of people watching and listening to what you're saying might be thinking, surely it's more important to put money, effort into resources into educating children rather than adults.
I mean, there are indeed various aspects to this topic. One is, of course, the right to education. As you indicated in your introduction, the right to education is the right for all people, including adults. So on the human rights perspective, there is a case for promoting adult education. But adult education is also really an instrument to promote sustainable development and to achieve many other goals in terms of development. It's clear for health, and we know that that was very clear during the COVID-19 crisis, that education was a key component of responses put forward by governments to actually prevent and react to the pandemic. It's also true for sustainable development and in particular climate change. So facing the urgency now that we are actually experiencing in terms of climate change, it is essential that efforts are also placed on the education of adults so that the changes in behavior in terms of consumption, but also in terms of production and in terms of political participation are immediate.
Where is this education coming from? Because really we're not just talking about adults sitting around in classrooms. I mean, an awful lot of what you're talking about here presumably is coming from people watching the radio, listening to the radio, watching the television, that kind of thing.
Indeed, what we've seen in recent years, and if we look like 10 years back, we've seen that the ecosystem of adult education has changed tremendously with the emergence of new actors, in particular when it comes to digital provision. So some of the largest actually providers of adult education are no longer governments or civil society organizations. They are large companies, global companies that provide access to education, to knowledge online. So that has, in a way, actually contributed to broadening and accelerating access to knowledge and education, but it has also raised other issues in terms of the protection of learners, but also in terms of regulation when it comes to the content, the pedagogy, the languages. That's also a major issue when it comes to adult education.
And how do you go about trying to persuade companies you mentioned there, but also governments, that this is something that they should be investing in, when you've got other needs that people are obviously concerned about, such as children's education, but all sorts of other things like health as well?
Well, UNESCO just had a big conference last week in Morocco, in Marrakesh, the international conference on adult education that takes place every 12 years. It gathered more than 140 countries. It's an intergovernmental conference, and that was actually the place for countries to reflect on those new issues, those new developments, those new opportunities, and to agree on certain principles in terms of the shaping of public policies when it comes to delivery, but when it comes also to inclusion. Because again, one of the key findings of the report that was presented in Marrakesh is that inclusion remains the key challenge. Participation is growing, but inequalities of access remain very important. And therefore, that's maybe the top priority for governments, to bridge that gap.
Good to end on your top priority. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today, David Atchoarena, who's head of UNESCO's Institute for Lifelong Learning. Thanks.
Thank you.